Hey up and welcome to the Strategy Sessions. My name is Andy Jarvis. I am the host of your show and the Strategy Director at XMO Marketing. If you have come to find out how to do research better, how to spot bad research, and just how to avoid all the bullshit that goes on in the industry when it comes to market research, you are in the right place. My guest today is Andrew Tenzer. Andrew uses research and creates insight to drive brand strategy. He's worked at Channel 4, he's worked at BBC, he's worked at Reach, he writes for Marketing Week. He knows a lot about research. We talk about what is the hallmarks of bad research, how you find it, how you can smell it, but also why that happens. Why is it that as people, we are looking for research or we hear bits of research and we just parrot them out and go, yeah, this is great. Oh yeah, that obviously makes sense. I'm recording this today on Blue Monday. I've left it until today to record it because it kind of fits with the episode. Why? Because Blue Monday is a perfect example of shit research that gets commonly accepted. Andrew explains why that happens, what's the reason behind it. I'm not going to go over it again here. Listen to what he says and he'll explain why that we buy into this bad research. But Blue Monday, well, it's great that people talk about mental health and checking on the friends and checking on themselves a lot on Blue Monday as well. That's great. That's not a problem. But the research behind it, and there is supposedly scientific research done by a scientist, a PhD guy or something like that. But it's all rubbish. It's made up. It's a PR story to sell holidays, right? You're supposed to feel blue in January. Why don't you book a summer holiday? They then paid for some research in inverted commas, which then is created, and now Blue Monday is a thing. We can be better than that, right? We can talk about mental health in better ways than that, and we can talk about research in better ways than that. So this is an episode where hopefully you will learn some things from it. What are the hallmarks of good research? How to spot the bad stuff? And how maybe what Andrew calls straight line thinking, where you go, oh, well, that makes sense, so that makes sense, so maybe this is the answer to the problem. Doesn't always work. Sometimes we have to interrogate it better. And as marketers, we've got to be better at that. So Andrew will be along in just a minute and you can have a listen to that and hear what he has to say and what his views and his insights into insight is. He'll be along in a minute. Before we do that, I just want to give you a quick little plug for an event, Learn Inbound, that I will be hosting. I'm not presenting at it. You won't learn anything from me other than how to do bad jokes. But I am hosting Learn Inbound. It is on the Monday, the 13th of March in Dublin. It is, or was pre-COVID, one of my favorite events to go to. I really enjoyed Learn Inbound. It was just laid back. It had a great ethos, a great feel about it. And it's great that it's back in person in Dublin. Monday, the 13th of March. It's from 9 till 5, one day, single track. It's at the Alex Hotel. So it's really central in Dublin. So come along, be part of that day. Tickets currently start at €249 for the day. That includes all access to all the talks, lunch, coffee, drinks, invites to the after party. That is the early bird ticket price. So if you go to learninbound.com, there's also a link in the show notes, so just have a look for that and you'll be able to find it. But if you go to learninbound.com, you'll be able to see that and buy a ticket. If you've never been to Dublin before, this is the time to go. March, just before St. Patrick's Day, it'll be a great time to be there. If you're obviously on the island of Ireland, just get there because I can see the speaker lineup on the website and it is epic. It is really, really good. There's some brilliant people on there. Gil David, who was a guest on this show just a few episodes ago, he's going to speak at the event. I mean, he'll be terrible. He always is, but don't worry. He doesn't listen anymore, so he doesn't know that I've said that. But there are some other great marketers going to be on the bill there. So learninbound.com. Make sure you grab your ticket for that and I will see you in Dublin. Enough of the promos. Let's get you on to listen to Andrew Tenzer. Just before we do that, one last thing. If you're listening, hit subscribe. I know everyone says it on YouTube videos and all that sort of thing, but it does make a difference. There's a lot of podcasts out there. And if you subscribe or you get it down, so it'll come on your downloads every 3 weeks when it comes out, at least then you don't miss a single episode. So hit subscribe, leave a review, tell me if you like it, if you dislike it, whatever. My contact details are in the show notes as well. Thanks very much, and let's get on with the show. Over to you, Andrew, talking to Andrew. I want to start by telling you about one of my favorite pieces of research, and then we're going to talk about research from there, really. So I'm going to talk to you about the Microsoft study about attention. And if you're listening to the show, you may well be familiar with this. It tells you that in 2017, I think, maybe 2016, that humans' attention span has fallen and is now shorter than your average goldfish. This is apparently down to the mobile phone that's stuck in your hand and it becomes an attention disaster for you. Therefore, the takeaway for marketers is that you have to produce shorter, catchier content. You have to be really attention grabbing and be upfront to people because our attention span's shorter than a goldfish. People quote this all the time. You probably see it on LinkedIn maybe once a month now. It's starting to ease down a little bit, but you definitely hear someone at a conference talk about it at every single conference. The problem with this research, Andrew, as I'm sure you're going to point out shortly, is that it's absolute bullshit. It's nonsense. It's been ridiculed in a BBC article. It has been disowned by Microsoft. It was never a Microsoft study in the first place. Somebody quoted it in a document that Microsoft had sponsored or had their name on, and the company behind it won't answer any questions about how they came up with their research, what their methodology was, or anything like that. And if you talk to professors in the industry about attention attribution, they don't understand how you'd measure it that way anyway. But this piece of research has legs. It has life. It lives, and people won't let it forget it. And what I want to talk about today with Andrew, a man who knows a lot about research and good research and probably a lot about bad research too, is how do we stop this sort of arse gravy flying around the marketing industry? I've talked enough there. Andrew, what's your view on the Microsoft study?
Well, like you, I've heard it presented many times. I think it's one of those things when, you hear it, first of all, the reason why it's got the people naturally kind of gravitate towards it to be true is because it feels instinctively true to a certain extent. But what they're mixing up is probably the difference between kind of media consumption and some of the platforms they consume content on versus what's actually going on in our human brain. And ultimately, it's nothing new when it comes to getting our attention, that we want something that's good and interesting to us. That's pretty standard. But yeah, I mean, it's something that's been talked about a lot, which, as you say, I've written very clear about how it's been ridiculed. And I think it comes down to a broader problem, certainly I guess in society to a certain extent, but particularly true of marketing, is that, there is what I consider to be quite a severe lack of critical thinking in the industry. I think that we tend to, a lot of the time, take things on face value. People are busy. They need something that supports a particular viewpoint. And I think one of the things that, I've experienced many times through my career is how often people will throw things into conversations as if they are a truth. And you hear something and it's like, that's just simply not true. But it's also quite hard to challenge in those environments because it might be just a small thing that's been said, but actually it can snowball into other things. And all of a sudden you've got ideas that are built off kind of simple untruths, which aren't evidence-based. And my view on things, and one of the things I learned very early on, particularly when it comes to research, is that if something doesn't seem quite right, if the data doesn't seem right, it's probably something wrong with it. And it's probably not right. So I think this is a bigger challenge, and it doesn't go away really. But people naturally gravitate to something which sounds like it could be really, instinctively true. When sadly people aren't kind of willing to kind of critically assess these things and kind of go to the source and whatnot.
I certainly know what you mean about being in those meetings where you have to make a decision about, are you going to challenge it? I sat through it was a trading discussion at a relatively large online retailer. And I was there effectively as a passenger. It wasn't my meeting. I was there more just to understand a little bit more about the background for the project we were going to be working on. And the senior person who offered 10 minutes of thought on how Gen Z are fundamentally different to millennials, who are fundamentally different to presented what I would class as sort of half-truths, falsehoods, and nonsense just as fact. But fact that actually has been published in other places telling you how different your customers are. And, you're sort of itching going, do I say it? Like knowing if I'd have said something, I'd have been thrown out of the meeting and that was the end of the project with them. And it's difficult to kind of take down every bit of bullshit that you hear, isn't it? Especially in research fields. You'd be the angry man on the internet all the time, wouldn't you? Going, this is wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, you obviously have to pick and choose your battles in those types of things. But I think more broadly that one of the biggest challenges, particularly in kind of fads in the marketing industry. I mean, I've written about this before, but I think generally what happens is that, someone very senior in the industry with a big following will say something. Let's take, we talked about this before, but let's talk about kind of social purpose marketing strategies
Mhm.
and how people buy, etc. Is that, someone very senior will talk about that, for example, maybe a CMO of Unilever
Just
or
for example,
P&G,
let's suggest that
for
it might have
example,
been.
let's suggest, and all of a sudden makes this statement about how people buy brands and what their values, that they want to buy brands based on their values and whatnot. And then all of a sudden, I think it just kind of kicks a whole industry into gear of not kind of kind of trying to prove that that is the case rather than taking a step back and actually questioning if that's true in the first place. And then you have this kind of ongoing cycle of frankly, a lot of it is bullshit, which is
Mhm.
talked about and then starts to be seeded into kind of everyday conversations and then becomes a truth, so to speak, which is actually not rooted in truth at all. And I think that's how the cycle of kind of these new fads in our industry just kind of get going. And it's very, very hard to,
Mhm.
to kind of push back against the kind of orthodoxy. It's like a snowball effect, basically. And I think that, and that's why when you do come out, and a lot of it is based on kind of shoddy research, because once you're trying to prove something rather than testing a hypothesis, then that leads to leading research, biased questions.
Mhm.
There's a whole other issue about whether the standards of market research are up to the standards maybe they once were. Maybe
Yeah,
touch on that in a bit, but
we
it's
will. Yeah.
it's just it's a vicious cycle.
Well, so we'll come back to, there's a couple of things you mentioned there about the standard of research and setting out to test a hypothesis as opposed to proving something. But I just want to go back to the bit now. Like again, hypothetically, let's say Marc Pritchard did say more than half of people are making choices on brands based on shared values, and more than half of people from Gen Z, all the way to boomers, really expect brands to take a stand on societal issues. Let's assume that he did say that because he did. I suppose where PR and marketing collide is that from a PR point of view, that is now true because it is now quoting from someone who is the chief brand officer at Procter & Gamble. So that is effectively a truth. Now, you might say that's based on bad research. I might say it's based on bad research, but it is a truth that is out there in the industry. And not everyone has that job title. So if you can quote the chief brand officer from P&G, it's back to nobody gets fired for hiring IBM, isn't it? Well, I've just quoted P&G, and P&G are the greatest at this, so I'm okay with that. That's really, really difficult, isn't it? Because it is, in effect, true to some extent, even if it's not backed by research, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that's why I think that, you know, people like Marc Pritchard have a bigger responsibility than they think they might have in
Mm-hmm.
that sense. But I still think there are other people who can challenge that. I think it's whether once someone like Marc Pritchard comes out with something like that, whether there is someone brave enough to say, actually, hang on, someone of a similar ilk
Yeah.
to turn around and say, well, actually, that might be your point of view, but that's not our point of view.
Yeah. Here's
It's
what the number.
difficult.
Yeah.
It's really difficult because naturally, if I think the thing that really puzzles me is how marketing is meant to be an evidence-based industry, and you
Mm-hmm.
know a lot of things are not evidence-based, so they like to talk a good game, but
Yeah.
doesn't quite back up in behavior.
So is that Mark Ritson, previous guest on the show, is a big believer that, and I may be misquoting him here, but well, it's not even a direct quote, but Ritson's a big believer that most of the problems in marketing are down to bad training or lack of training, not bad training, just no training generally. So by having no training, you're unable to sort of spot the issues in the research and things like that. What's your view? Is it bad training, or is some of this down to just our inherent bias as people? Because we are quite a predictably stupid species, aren't we? You know, we when something speaks to a bias that we already have, we just don't interrogate it in the way that we do when something speaks to a bias. You know, when something contradicts us, we want to go and find out why it's wrong. But when something agrees with us, like, oh yeah, great, of course it agrees with what we think. So is it training? Is it bias? Is it both?
Yeah, I mean, I think written a lot about this, done a lot of work around bias and things like that. Like with anything in life, it's nuance, isn't it? And it is a bit of this, a bit of that. I think when it comes to training, I suppose I'm not a what you would call a traditional marketeer. I've come up through insight and moved into brand roles. Um, but I think there is probably an element, which probably social media can take quite a lot of responsibility for in the digital world, in terms of, if I see one more tweet on Twitter about, 10 things you'll do which you'll become an effective marketeer, and it's just, those type of stuff just drives me mad.
Yeah.
But obviously training is important, just equally, in market research, training and learning the methodology and sampling and questionnaire design, all those things. Absolutely, training is very important. I think for me, and we wrote about it a lot, me and my co-author Ian Murray, when we published the aspiration window, which is something that hadn't been talked much about at the time, was obviously the composition of the marketing industry in more broadly. So essentially, there is a severe lack of social diversity in the industry. So we found that 70% of people working in marketing and advertising grew up in a household where the highest income earner was social grade AB, and that's just compared to 30% of the UK population as a whole. And why is that important is because we've done lots of research where we've tested marketeers against various frameworks and cross-cultural psychology questions versus the general population. And effectively, what we found is that people in marketing and advertising see, think, experience, and interpret the world differently to kind of large swathes of the population. And I think that obviously has huge ramifications in terms of your daily output. And the challenge with bias is that we're all biased. Anybody that tells you that they aren't biased or they don't suffer from bias is lying. The simple fact is that the best way to overcome your biases is to surround yourself with people who have different biases to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, people working in marketing tend to be culturally and socially quite similar. And that's that's the way it is. But that creates a problem because people aren't, marketers like to think that people aren't, people are sitting at home thinking about what brand believes or the values they have, particularly at the current time, while social purpose is talked about so much in terms of marketing, people are just like, they're wondering like how they're going to put food on the table, right? Or how they're going to pay their gas and electricity bills. And I think that's, I don't think people in the industry realize how privileged they are on the whole. But I think that goes back to what Marc Pritchard would talk about, is kind of customer orientation. Like, 101, you are not a customer of your brand. So, and my view and the work I've done is all about kind of showcasing, look, you need to understand the differences between people like you who work in an elitist industry like marketing and just the general population, because actually if you can understand the differences, you can then start to identify, okay, this isn't how certain people think versus how I think. And I think it brings a new outlook on how to approach things. And I don't think that's just a marketing thing. I think that's a research issue as well, in terms of even the types of questions that people ask. Because even things like social purpose, I think, you see those terrible statements where it's like, I'm more likely to buy a brand who shares my values, etc. Like I said, that's such a forced question, because people are not going down the pub with their mates and saying, you know what, I really wish my deodorant, shared the same values as me. That's just not how people live in the real world. And a lot of the problem with research is it's context neutral.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the biggest challenges, is how you overcome that from a research perspective. And one of the ways to do that is to not ask people things which are forced, and it's just not how people operate and
I
live their
think
lives.
you mentioned Ritson, and probably the favorite thing of mine that Ritson's ever said is that marketing's job is to be the voice of the customer in the room. And even if you don't do that through research, even if you have very limited ways to actually do that practically, by thinking in that terms, it changes you to a customer orientation. It stops you saying things like "I think," and start to going, "I wonder what does for our customer." That's something that's really helped me in terms of sitting in meetings, and even throwing that back now as a consultant rather than in-house, throwing that back to people like, what does the customer say? Who's bringing the voice of the customer into the room here? I don't care what you think. If you think that purple's better than that blue, it's irrelevant. What does the customer think? And trying to have that view on it. But I want to take you down the path now of talking a little bit about the research and bias in research, because you started talking about there, and I think we can dive a little bit deeper in how some of this research comes about. So you mentioned in one of your pieces a question you ask when you're at events about do people want to buy from a company with great social purpose or something? Do you want to talk about that for a minute, and then we'll talk about how do you avoid asking questions like that in research, and how can you really find out where social purpose really matters for people?
Yeah, sure. Well, obviously it's an area that we, looked into, researched for sort of 4 or 5 years now. Um, you know, the standard thing is that a lot of research gets published by consultancies and people that are pushing a particular agenda around,
Some
people's
people with a
buying
product to sell,
behaviors
perhaps.
with a product to sell. And a lot of it is based on, quite frankly, leading. Some of them are quite ludicrous, really, some of the statements that people ask. Because the thing is that, if you ask someone to agree or disagree with the statement, if I was to ask, and this is where going in, and when I do talks and I use this as an example, if I ask you, you know, are you more likely, so who here is more likely to buy from a brand who does good for society or does good for the environment? Of
Mate,
course, everyone's going to put their hands up, right? It's a socially desirable response, but it's also the response that you want to believe yourself. Oh, yes, of course, I would do that. And then, you ask people, okay, well, how many people have bought something from Amazon in the last week? And everyone's hand goes up.
mate,
And I think
mate.
that's there are, that's just a small example, but there is a real world example, is to look at the success of Amazon. If you really cared about the environment, sustainability, I'm not sure that and also just workers' rights and how people are treated. Um, you know, Making no allegations here, but just what you read about. It's very clear that if you really were a purpose, a conscious consumer, there's no way that you would buy anything from Amazon, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, the prices are great, and it arrives the next day, and you've paid for Prime anyway, and you get music through
Convenience.
the Alexa in the corner. And but of course, I want to use social purpose, but they're doing it at half the price, so I'll just order it from Amazon.
Exactly. And I think, research can be designed, is clearly designed to elicit a kind of socially desirable response. And even when someone is answering a survey on their laptop on their own, we still are inclined to give a socially biased response anyway. And that's a huge challenge for trying to get under the skin of people's behavior. And a lot of people, I guess there's people in two camps. Like, there's some people who just never believe, you can't ever ask someone a direct question, because they don't tell you the truth in surveys, etc. And then there's the other side, which kind of just like, will take any old question and accept it as a truth and say, oh, regardless of what the question is or how it's framed, etc. And I think there is, a skilled researcher knows how to ask the right question and how to frame it in the right way, because I've done a lot of people talk about behavioral science techniques, and implicit responses and things like that. In all my years of doing research, I've used more or less every methodology under the sun: explicit, implicit line of questioning. And to be honest, I've never learned an insight or learned anything that from an implicit research technique that I haven't found just by asking someone a question, framing it in the right way. Now, that might be that I'm just not using the right methodologies, or it's the particular subject at that time. So, it's very simple. When we go and buy products and we go into the supermarket, or we go in, we're researching online, we think about a number of factors when we buy products. We don't think about one factor. And the problem with the way that social purpose is researched is it boils it down to, out
binary,
of context. It's a binary thing. Agree, disagree. Most of the time, people always, it has to be with agree, disagree scales. Most of the time, people agree anyway, because of the way that the questions are worded. But there are really, really simple ways just to get to the true size of how people buy brands. There's obviously, you can do things like conjoint analysis, where you trade one thing off another, which is more important, etc., etc. Or you could do it very basic. When you're buying a brand in this category, it's almost like category entry points, right? What are the things that you consider important when you buy them? And
so
you
then
list
you list
them out.
10, 15 things or whatever, and have a scale.
Exactly. You've got 10 feet, not a scale, just to select. And it's there where you get to the truth, because effectively what you get is that, things like, sustainability, things like a brand's position on a social issue, etc. It's very, very low. It's around about, on political issues and things like that, it's around about 7 or 8%. On sustainability, it's around about 30-ish%. It's actually, the last research I did, it had come down because of the cost of living, and but I also think it's come down because I think for too long the industry has tried to use green issues as a point of difference, whereas I've always felt that it's a hygiene thing, and that people have an expectation around how their products are going to be around the environment. But what comes up very clearly, and you said it just before, quality, reliability, convenience, like by far and away the most important things. And I think that's partly the problem with marketing and advertising more broadly, is that there's too much focus on the things that have less of an influence in driving buying behaviors. And actually a point of difference now might actually be just focusing on your product and proving that it's a good product that will help improve your life,
And is this, do you think though that the focus on the margins, for want of a better phrase, that the points that are a bit lower down, is that just the nature of very competitive sectors? Because like you say, to be in the game, your product has to do the same things as everyone else's product. Your pricing is probably going to be in the same sort of ballpark as everyone else's product, because you're going to be sold in broadly the same places as everybody else's product. So, all the important factors, it's hard to get any differentiation on. So to find somewhere to differentiate, you've got to move down that ladder a little bit, haven't you? And you get to point 8, 9, and 10, you're like, oh, we can do social purpose. We can do it differently. Is that the kind of the thinking that takes you to that point?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is, although I think that shows a lack of creativity on the industry's part, because, you can differentiate. Why does differentiation have to be about social purpose? That actually most people, it's not to say that people don't care about. Of course they care about the environment and climate change and all of those things. But it's a good example of what I think is kind of riddled in our industry, is what we would call straight line thinking, which my co-author Ian Murray termed quite nicely. It's this idea of kind of like A to B is very linear, So therefore, yes, of course, 90% of UK adults consider climate change, one of the biggest issues, or the single biggest issue facing our country today or the world today. Therefore, because it's a big issue, I will focus on that in my advertising. So it's taking big societal issues and thinking that's how to sell a product.
For
Whereas
my beans
actually,
brand.
yeah, yeah, and actually, it's just about, well, there are many ways to differentiate your brand creatively, in how you market your product. It doesn't have to be, oh well, differentiation. It's hard to do it on price or you know quality of product because it's identical to this one. Therefore, we have to talk about saving the world and things like that, rather than actually let's just do some really cool, funny marketing. And that coincides with obviously all the data which shows that humor is becoming less of a priority in advertising over the years. And let's not forget, social purpose is pretty serious stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
So so it's no surprise that's the case. But yeah, I think it naturally. I think I've been in so many meetings, so many talks I've given, particularly at places like media agencies and stuff like that, where obviously the audience is quite young, and they see it as a point of difference. Whereas actually, if everyone's doing it, it's not very different at all. And look, if it can be effective,
Mm-hmm.
then I'm not saying that it can't be effective for some brands. It can be effective, um, but when you've got brands like Carlsberg talking about seals in the ocean and saving seals in the ocean, I just don't get it at
Yeah.
all. It's just
And
you know
I think there's where you see purpose being done well, and I think there's a swing in the pendulum with the industry, people saying purpose is overdone, it's pointless, and you don't need to do it. And I'd probably agree. Like the investors who savaged, is it Hellman's mayonnaise talking about brand purpose? It's like, it doesn't need to do it. But what I think, where the companies who do it really well and where it actually makes sense, that can actually have a real power for them, can't it? When it actually does make sense to what you do. I mean, this hoodie is made by a company called Rapa Nui on the Isle of Wight, and they recycle. Once you finish with it, you send it back. They'll recycle it, make it a new hoodie. They do a lot with Surfers Against Sewage because they're based by the beach, and they have a whole kind of ethical. That's a kind of social purpose, green credentials.
that's a business strategy, isn't it? A business
Exactly, yeah.
strategy which then goes into marketing strategy, etc.,
Absolutely.
etc.
But why did I buy the hoodie? It fits me really well. The price was what I wanted to pay, and it looked good. It was nice to to give them the money because they're doing good things. But if I'm kidding myself and anyone else if I told you I wouldn't have just bought it from Next if they had the right thing in my size at a similar price. I would have done, right?
Yeah,
That's just
yeah,
so.
yeah, absolutely.
So you mentioned some of the people you present to and quite maybe young audiences, and maybe we've talked a little bit about people not having the training for this as well. One of the blessings / curses of the last 10, 15 years is that market research is now really, really easy to do. It used to be when I started out in marketing, when TVs were still black and white, if you wanted to do proper market research, you needed a very big budget with lots of zeros on the end. Now you just need a couple of hours and a couple of £100, right? Is that a good thing?
Yes, I've written about this too. Well, yes and no. I think the consequences of research being so readily available and easy to do is a problem for a couple of reasons. One um, is that because it's so easy to do and so quick to do, people are now able to, whereas they may have been methodical in how they approached ideas and how they would, they have an idea and think, well, actually, this could be a good business decision for us, etc., etc. The pace in which, businesses work nowadays, you can have this idea and say, okay, well, actually, I can go and do some quick research, quick, dirty research, and then I can go back with my research which says, here's my stat, this is why we should do this, etc., etc. And so I think it doesn't give people I think sometimes people need to slow down and just take a step back, and having to spend more time on how you go about researching this and being methodical, I think is better. Which obviously, like the immediacy of research now, which doesn't allow as much for that approach. I think the second thing is that, like you say, anybody can do research now without the necessary training and things like that. And it's resulted, I think, in research which gets done, which is just not methodologically sound. And once you fall at that first hurdle, you are then making decisions off bad research.
Back to the famous shit in, shit out phrase.
Yeah, basically. And I think, I mean, I've seen it, myself in kind of over my time working in research, that maybe certainly I've seen from a client side perspective, that I think a lot of client side research teams don't necessarily have the grounding in kind of primary research that maybe they once did. I think the other thing as well is just, obviously we can't talk about this without talking about just data more generally, and the explosion of customer data and things. And, I think we're moving into kind of like a post big data era, if I'm honest. You don't really hear that term much anymore. Back in sort of 2009, 2010, it was all anyone talked about: big data, big data.
Yeah.
And then the realities came of actually it's quite hard to use all that data and to tell you something meaningful. But I think, there has been a conflation between data and research. Data is the input, and insight is the output. So you have these companies going down, go for a data strategy. It's not a data strategy, really. It's an insight strategy, which is fueled by data. I think we often get it the wrong way round when we're talking about these things. And, again, with just data at people's fingertips, albeit customer data, proprietary data, it makes executive teams used to having numbers at their fingertips. So they can turn around to their data person and say, right, I need to know this, 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 and this. And they can, say, okay, leave it with me, and be back in half an hour after they've pulled the data from their various data warehouses or whatnot. If someone comes to you and say, well, I need to know this, 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 and this, but it's a market research question, if I go back and say, well, I'm going to need, we're going to need to do some research on that. We're going to need to, do some quant or some qual, come back to you in 3 or 4 weeks with an answer. Your, research is almost competing with the immediacy of customer data. And unfortunately, in those two instances, the data side tends to always win. And again, that's why then research sometimes can be demoted, because it just can't compete with the immediacy of it. But they're trying to, which is where some of the challenges are.
And what about the quality of some of that data as well? I mean, there's been numerous reports and studies over the years about how inaccurate, things like, the data you can pull from social media is about your audience and things like that, but it's still presented as the truth, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, how many people, when they register for something, gives a date of birth of 1920 or something like that.
Whatever the last option is. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. And I think, obviously it's a big industry as well, because you have these, social media monitoring companies, social media listening tools. And the thing is what they've done over the years is they've become more sophisticated, and they're, bringing together different data sets to, overlay demographic information, etc., etc. But actually, I mean, I've never dug into it personally, but, I don't know how good that modeling is, and how, it's really challenging. That's why, for me, I'm always a fan of the kind of gold standard data sets that you get, things like, TGI, it gets, some people kind of, criticize it, but it's still the gold standard for kind of media planning, and you can trust that that data is accurate.
I love the Ofcom communications market report. Not always overly useful depending on what you're looking to do, but how people engage with different elements of the media. I just think it's a stunning bit of research. I actually enjoy reading it. I'm just boring, aren't I? That's all it is. But I do enjoy when it comes out every year. I'm like, oh, this is brilliant. Just great to understand proper methodological research, methodical research even. That's what I'm after. That takes a good sample size, different demographics, age groups, whatever, and really kind of pulls it apart and says, this is actually how people are using it. TV's dying.
I would counter that. I personally am not a fan of that research.
Oh,
I think
tell me why. Because I once
it.
saw a presentation from the lead researcher as a bit of a fanboy, and I was like, I love everything and where they're going. So tell me why I'm wrong with this, please.
I think partially because with Ofcom, I don't want to criticize, but they kind of representing all media, and what it shows to me is that they often have a lack of understanding of the intricacies of different media, which then plays out in how they ask questions, the type of questions they ask, even things like they report on, I say I work for Reach, which is obviously the largest commercial news publisher. There is syndicated audience data on, how much people consume our brands in digital, etc. Yet they publish claimed research on usage, as if it's a truth, when actually they could just use research, syndicated data, which is, industry currency, etc., which leads me to be more skeptical of some of the other stuff in there. And the thing is, the good thing is they do make all the data tables available. I've had to, certainly in my last role, remove some of that research from strategy papers, which we're using it to make a case where I sort of said that's not right. The way that's asked is wrong. There's a lack of understanding of how, people consume this, people consume that. But I understand it because media is, particularly media, it's specialized. And, if you work in digital publishing, you have an intricate knowledge of digital publishing that a general all-rounder in the research team are, who are Ofcom a brilliant research team. I'm not, methodologically and, the way they approach it, absolutely. But I think it suffers from a lack of understanding of the nuances of different types of media.
That is great to know. Thank you very much. Which is one of the reasons why I do the podcast, because then you find stuff out like this, which then makes you think, okay, I maybe need to go at this with a different viewpoint. So thanks for that. That's really useful.
No worries. I don't think I'll ever get a job at Ofcom.
I know, anyway. That's it. Well, speaking about work, before we do talk about your work and what you've done and where you're going next, we were kind of getting into it before I talked about Ofcom, about the data that social media companies collect, and they are aggressively collecting lots and lots of data, which the EU are trying to at least rein in somewhat. You're on TikTok at the Tenzer. Eximo Marketing's on TikTok too, but we don't really use it. TikTok are harvesting data aggressively, even by Facebook Meta standards. What's your thoughts on what they're doing with that, what they're using, where the ethical standards lie as well?
I mean, I've never been a big fan of social media. In terms of the way that the companies operate. I think it's hard. I mean, all the research shows that they're not trustworthy. And I think there's a lack of transparency, and I think this is the problem. And I think it's also, I think there are wider questions about the role of social media companies in society and what they're doing to society. I think for me, Twitter's really interesting because for me, Twitter is is a journalist platform. And I think Twitter is one of the most dangerous things that's happened for our society, because essentially Twitter is full of a very small proportion of the population with very loud voices, and the news agenda is basically taken from Twitter. And then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because something which you say, okay, well, that's not representative of real life, then it starts to be reported in the news and publishers, and all of a sudden it's kind of like it's creating this kind of cycle where you're kind of bringing it into the real world. So morally, I have a big problem with Twitter and what it's done, and how it regulates itself. And that's why I found it quite funny. I did a TikTok app on it, actually. Like, I've got huge sympathy for people that have lost their jobs at Twitter. It genuinely, I know people that genuinely sounded like it was a fantastic place to work. Like, people really passionate about working there. But I don't like the revisionism that I've seen, that Twitter before Elon Musk bought it was this like utopian paradise, and then all of a sudden he's bought it, and it's this like free for all, racist, misogynistic kind of bloodbath of which brands shouldn't be part of. That is how Twitter has always been. It's always been a cesspit of racism and misogyny. Elon Musk buying it hasn't changed that. He might have brought a few people back onto the platform.
Might have pumped the tires of it a little bit, but
yeah,
it was always there.
Pump the tires, but it's always like that. And this is the thing: is I can't quite get my head round. We take it, if you draw comparisons with social purpose, is that the advertising industry and brands are talking about how they want to make the world a better place, simultaneously funding and sending huge amounts of money and funding platforms which are basically causing and being the root causes of some of these problems in the first place, like a growth in racism, a growth in misogyny, etc., etc. And I really, really can't get my head around.
We're recording this just 24 hours after Brazilians stormed the Supreme Court and presidential palace. Was it in Brasilia?
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Fueled by, not just by Twitter, to be clear, I suppose, not just by Twitter.
Not just Twitter. But...
Ex-President Bolsonaro had a lot to do with it as well. But the lack of action in countering disinformation, as we started off the episode talking about, shit research travels because it appeals to people's biases. And social media is the fuel for this being able to travel, whether it's bad research, misinformation about politics, racism. Social media allows that to move quickly. And to go back to what was it, Mark Twain quote, was it, about I'm going to get this wrong now, about the truth still strapping its boots on while a lie's gone all the way around the world, or something along those lines anyway. But social media is the fuel for that fire, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as well, just on the point about data, is that people are willing. I think this goes back to the point about data exchange more broadly. What it shows is that people might say that they're worried about their data and how it's used. The simple fact is, you give me. It's all about value exchange, right? Millions and millions of people are gladly handing their behavioral data over to TikTok, right? Because they get, it's an enjoyable content experience. It adds value to their lives. Exactly. And I think that's just it's almost like everything in life generally is a bit of a value exchange, isn't it? And I don't think data is any different. Obviously, it's different when it comes to kind of, financial information and things like that, with the banks you use, and, you have an expectation that they're going to look after your data. I think for some people, the whole data thing is a bit intangible. I think, look, transparency is the way. I mean, I remember when I was at Channel 4 and we kind of led the way on we call it a viewer relationship strategy. But, we were very clear from the outset, the transparency around what we were using data for. Problem is, these tech giants, they're not always the most transparent in how they're going to use it. But most people are like, oh yeah, whatever, okay, I just want to watch the In-Betweeners, on catch up, just there you go. So but yeah, I do think there's accountability
So
from social media companies.
tell me this: you were at Channel 4, part of the audience research team. Did anyone ever do any research on how many goddamn ads there are on Channel 4 streaming service? It's infuriating trying to. Zaid Al Qassab was on years ago. He's the Channel 4 chief marketing officer. Yeah. I should have asked him this question instead of you, but it's infuriating.
Well, I mean, I think, look, they were always trying to optimize. You know, you're trying to optimize, and I think very early they were quite good at kind of putting how long the ads were. Mm-hmm. Because, you know, it's like Rory Sutherland always talks about. It's like when you go to a station, to a train, you can wait. It's fine if the train is 10 minutes away, but at least you know it's 10 minutes away. But if there isn't a time, a board there saying, then you're just like, you're infuriated. And I think in a way that makes it slightly easier. But I think that's partially driven by, you know, I think what probably makes it worse is it's in comparison. You know, All 4 is competing with Netflix, it's competing with Amazon Prime without the ads, and I think that's always a hard challenge. So they're probably just be best to, like, you know, have slightly less adverts than ITVX or something, and they might be all right to get away with it. But
yeah, definitely.
So. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there was. I can't remember specifically.
So we're not pinning the blame on you, Andrew. That's okay. I'll let you off.
No, nothing to do with me.
So you've worked at Channel 4. We'll discuss. You've worked at Reach. Again, sort of people. Just explain a little bit more about Reach. I mean, I have a brief idea. You've probably been on a Reach website, even if you didn't really know it. But you'll see it on the pop-up when it comes to data. So, who are Reach, and what sort of couple of brands that people might know of that they?
Yeah. So
the front end of that.
Yeah, so I went from Channel 4 to BBC, which obviously needs no explanation. And then I went to Reach. So Reach, they're the largest commercial publisher in the UK. So they own they own about 75 brands, or maybe more. So it's brands like the Mirror, the Daily Express, the Express. So two very polar opposites in terms of their politics. OK Magazine. If you're in London, Football London. We also own a lot of the regional titles. So, you know, you've got, well, we own, I say we, I don't work there anymore, but, you know, Manchester Evening News, Liverpool Echo, the Record app in Scotland. So a kind of quite diverse portfolio of brands.
And the live sites are Reach, aren't they? Like, so Belfast Live and Southampton Live or whatever. They're all Reach as well.
Yeah, they're all Reach as well. So the Live network was kind of really I guess, as a means to modernize the regional landscape in the digital sense, which has proved very successful for them.
And you've recently bailed out of full-time employment, so you know you've got some big stamps there on your CV. BBC, you know, a global brand. Channel 4, brilliant national brand. Reach maybe doesn't have the awareness in some sectors, but I think people in the marketing industry will know Reach and will go, wow, okay. And now you've taken that fun / terrifying move to go freelance. What drove that decision, and what sort of projects are you looking to get your teeth stuck into?
Yeah, so I think I've obviously been working in kind of big media brands for quite a long time. And I think you get to a point where you kind of seen everything, done everything. And, you know, you're working in very kind of fast-paced environments that, you know, effectively can take its toll on you a little bit, you know, from a kind of well-being perspective, because, you know, there's just so much going on. And particularly, I think, in an environment that people are facing a very challenging, you know, economic landscape. You know, no business is going to be immune from that. But equally, you know, Reach gave me a platform for my work. I was very fortunate to publish some very big industry acclaimed studies like the Empathy Delusion and the Aspiration Window, which, you know, enabled me to write for Marketing Week and, you know, speak to people all over the country and even outside of the UK. And
got links in the show notes to them, so just click around where you're listening or watching and you can find a link straight to those.
Cool. And I think it just felt like the right time to kind of take a step back and say, actually, I've accumulated all this knowledge, and I kind of want to work for myself. And I think for me, I want the I'm looking for kind of a diversity of projects and being able to kind of get involved in lots of exciting things across different sectors and media brands. But equally, I've been doing. I was able at Reach again. They allowed me to kind of set up the brand function. I think what that was good for is it also gave me great experience in kind of content creation, marketing, particularly brand strategy. So I led huge amounts of brand strategy work at Reach, and actually the last thing I did before I left was I launched and created our first ever dedicated youth brand called Curiously, which is launched if you want to check that out on social. Quite big on TikTok. For a time where my team were responsible for creating content on TikTok for the Mirror and the Star. The Star was good fun because obviously it's quite a funny brand and it resonated really well with kind of young men, which is where we wanted to take the brand in social, particularly on the youth platforms. So I think it's just looking for variety and being able to work with some really great people and just be able to hopefully with my knowledge pass on that knowledge and help people understand consumers better, because ultimately that's the root of and the heart of what I've been doing for however many years.
I've got a friend who was a pilot in the RAF when we were at university together, and he talks about the 1 in 60 rule, which I think, if I get this right, is that for every degree off course you will be 1 mile off course for every 60 minutes flying time. So you start off a little bit off course and you obviously end up miles away the more off course you are. I use that analogy sometimes. I always refresh myself because I've probably told it wrong, but before I give it, it's about how you should use research at the beginning of a project and get it right, because you can make all the right assumptions or you can make all the right decisions, but if you're basing it on faulty research, you're already set off in the wrong direction. So with that in mind, surely you're going to be the busiest man in all of the marketing industry in the next 10 years, right? Because everyone should be saying we need research, and we need proper research done by somebody who knows what they're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to think that people will see me as someone who can help them with that, even if it's from an advisory perspective. Yeah, I mean, it's just I think that it's people talk about when you have times of recession, obviously marketing budgets get slashed and all of those types of things, but we know from the great work done by the IPA that when everyone else goes quiet during a recession or that actually spending your way out can be a really effective way of growing your business. And I think the same applies to market research. I think that naturally when it comes to a economic downturn, a lot of the time market research teams feel the pinch and, okay, we're going to take this research budget away from you, etc. But I think it's those brands and businesses who still invest in the research, still invest in getting it right, are the ones that are going to win, because they're going to have a starting understanding of consumer needs and perceptions and things like that. So, I think it's tempting for people to say, okay, well, let's just cut that budget there. But actually, I think it's what helps you stand out from the rest. So I would hope that there are people out there that can see the value of research in difficult times like we're in at the moment.
Brilliant. And let's finish this little section off just by what's the best way for people to get in touch with you? Is it social media? Is it via your website? What's the best way to get hold of you?
Yeah, just my handle on Twitter and TikTok is the Tenzer, or if you want to contact me on LinkedIn, I'm also available there.
Perfect. Links to those in the show notes as well, so check them out. So as we get to the end, I always like to ask the guests about where a book they'd recommend, or books plural they'd recommend for the audience. Anything particularly that's influenced you, or that you think people should read to get a good understanding of market research, or even just anything else generally in marketing?
Yeah, it's not. I actually think the best marketing books aren't really about marketing at all. So I would probably say the book that's had the most influence on me in my career is probably The Road to Somewhere by David Goodhart.
I think that's the first
And
time anyone's ever mentioned that.
yeah, so it's basically underpinned or been the main inspiration for a lot of the work, like the empathy delusion and why we should trust our gut instinct and the aspiration window, was underpinned by that book, which I read in 2017. It was a book published after, in response to Brexit, and basically David Goodhart um, talked about, kind of tried to understand why Brexit and the election of Donald Trump happened. And you might have heard it talked about how the anywheres and the somewheres, um, effectively the kind of anywheres are this small ruling media elite, and the anywheres are, and the somewheres are kind of the mass market, or the main part of the population. And essentially what he argued with really thorough evidence was that, the anywheres and somewheres in the past have been much closer together, through society, through the church, all these types of things, and basically how they veered away. And essentially things like Brexit and the election of Donald Trump was a pushback of the somewheres to the anywheres. And it just had a really, really profound impact on me and my view of the world. And it just coincided quite nicely with the work. I just joined what was Trinity Mirror at the time, which is now Reach. And no one wanted to talk about those things. And then all of a sudden Brexit happened, and it's like, oh, maybe we are a bit out of touch. And, community is important, all these types of things. Is a really fascinating book, and I still think it's absolutely relevant today. And I think it helps, hopefully, people to understand and empathise with people that maybe they can't traditionally empathise with, as we see when, how people talk about Brexiteers, etc., etc. I just think it's a really important book, so I'd highly recommend it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. And I think I'm going to order it in the next 10 minutes, because it sounds like the sort of thing I need to read too. So, brilliant. Often when people say, it's this book, I'm like, oh yeah, it's just over there on the shelf. But no, not even come across that one, so I can't wait.
I wasn't going to say How Brands Grow.
I thought you were going to say the Viz book that I've got in the top corner, but that's
a good one. That's a good one.
One day I might just make a whole podcast reading it out, but not until I want to get cancelled, I'd imagine. So anyway, moving on. Listen, Andrew, thank you very much for your time. It's been brilliant having you on, and hopefully you get stacks of business out of the back of this. So thank you for your time.
I hope so. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.